we're really looking forward to this workshop with you, Whitney. We'll go over the platform that Whitney uses to conduct peer assessment in her classes. And then we have some great questions, some great insights from Whitney. And it's really, you know, Whitney, you have the experience as a professor teaching students with peer assessment, but you also have experience working with other faculty and helping them adopt technology and make the most out of it. So there's two really great perspectives there that I'm going to be asking you about throughout the workshop. And, you know, without further ado, I'm just going to share my screen. And while I do that, I'll just note, we want this to be helpful for everyone. We want this to be interactive. If you have questions, we do have a Q&A at the end, but don't feel like you have to just wait. Put them in the chat. We'll address them throughout. We want this to be, you know, valuable and interesting and fun, potentially, for all of you. So with that, I am going to share my screen. You should see this slide right there. And I'm going to go share my screen. Perfect. So like I said, we're going to be talking a little bit about peer assessment, a little bit about the Kritik platform, which Whitney uses, and there's some features there that, you know, will be referenced throughout. There's a couple activities that we'll be touching on specifically. Whitney will have a chance to share, you know, what she had in mind for the activities, how she ran them, what they were like in terms of the benefits for the students, talking about a feature, spotlighting, which is essentially modeling effective feedback and or strong assignments for students. And then panel discussion, which is just me asking questions to Whitney, as well as any of your questions that come up throughout the workshop. So really looking forward to that. Before we begin, you know, we've heard of peer assessment, but what are some of the benefits here? So, you know, many of us have experienced peer assessment, or students have heard of peer assessment in their middle school days or their younger education days, but really applying this in the university realm, it's a little bit different. We want to approach it from in a more professional, higher thinking way. So one of the benefits is decreasing grade turnaround time and grading burden. This means involving students in the evaluation process. So by doing this, they're more involved, but it also means that they receive more feedback in a more timely manner, which is obviously the ideal, because you want to provide feedback so that they can take that, they can have actionable items that they can then apply to their next work. You know, if the feedback comes a couple of weeks later and they can't apply it for their next work, then there's kind of a wasted opportunity there. As well, increases material comprehension and engagement. If you are assigned work, you complete the work and then you submit it, but then you also see multiple peers' work in front of you and you're evaluating that, you're interacting in a much deeper way. Your exposure to the content is increased, and now you're seeing different ways that a problem or solution or assignment can be approached. So you're seeing things multiple times, but also in different ways. So that helps with comprehension and engagement as well. Metacognition. So if you're a professor here joining us, this is probably something that is very instinctual. You probably don't think about it, but when you go to assess or evaluate another piece of work, you have to think about how you're, your thought process, how you're approaching it, how they approached it. This is where the metacognition comes in, and it's a great thing to build your skills and your understanding, and it's something that students are required to do through that evaluation process, as well as increases the opportunity for practical application of course material. This is something that we're really going to explore here with Whitney, teaching pre-service teachers how to be strong teachers when they graduate. They're going to have to evaluate their students' work. They're going to have to do a lot of these things that they're already practicing within Kritik. But whether you're a pre-service teacher, whether you're going into the law profession, which we had a conversation yesterday, or English, there's often this element of peer review that we all encounter later on in our careers after we're done in our academic path. So very much the application in the real world is there. Provides new opportunities for transferable skill development. This is very much attached to the real world skill development, but not only that, being able to provide and receive critique or evaluation from others is just generally a great thing to be able to develop and learn. The soft skills, how do you communicate that point? If I want to develop some criticisms or some input to Whitney, how am I going to do that in a way that motivates Whitney, but also encourages her and shows her, what are those actionable things that she can do to improve her next work? So it's all those aspects coming together, and we'll explore those in different ways and in terms of Whitney's experience in just a few moments. Great. So in terms of Kritik peer assessment, there's 3 stages, and probably most people are aware of the first two, which is the create and evaluate, which means you assign the work, they submit the work, and then they're paired anonymously with their peers, either 3, 4, 5 of their peers, to then evaluate their work. This additional stage, the feedback stage, is really important because it allows students to actually improve their evaluations and understand where their evaluation is good. Could they be more specific? And that's basically, it means the students will take their evaluations and then provide feedback to their peers saying, was it specific? Was it motivational? Was it critical? And I'll show you that in just a second in terms of the scale that we use to provide that feedback. Great. And there's a bunch of different features, but a few that come to mind here. There's group work. So just like you set up an individual assignment with peer assessment, you can do the same for group work. As well, there's calibration, which we'll touch on soon with Whitney's experience, but that essentially means it's an opportunity for you as professor to understand where the students are at in terms of their evaluation skills. So you're identifying the starting spot for them, and as Whitney will share, you're able to see if certain students need a little bit of work, need a bit of help or remediation there, and then you can support them exactly where they need faster than you could kind of without this type of calibration. And then spotlighting, which is something that Whitney uses. It's pretty simple. We probably do it already in many contexts, but it's when you come across a strong piece of work or a strong evaluation, you click that spotlight button and you're able to put that on your course profile so students can refer to that, and you can add a note so they can understand what exactly made that strong, what can they take from that for their own work. Perfect. So what I'm going to do is come out of this and actually demonstrate here using the professor's perspective. In this case, this is a profile. So you can get a sense of the platform that Whitney would have in front of her as a professor. So over time, you can see how students are doing in terms of their different stages. Just gives you a really high level view. This would be the spotlight feature that I just referred to. So essentially, when you come to one of these strong evaluations, you can click a button, it gets added to that section of the course. You could add a little note, of course, maybe more extensive than what's currently written here, to say, why was this strong? How can you learn from that? And then there's different stages, as I just mentioned. So you can look at the create phase, which is you setting up the activity for your students. And that would involve, the objective, the instructions, and I'll show a couple examples that Whitney has implemented in her class, the schedule for the assignment, as well as the rubric. So there's this structure, regardless of what activity, regardless of how you're using the platform, you want to maintain this similar structure in terms of the objective, instructions, rubric, because it maintains consistency for the students so they can become comfortable with the system and then improve more so over time. And Whitney, I have to say, you do a great job in terms of providing additional resources, and I'll show that in just a moment. But that kind of information and specifics to really get the students on the path to success. So there's no guesswork on their end to say, hey, what do I need to be successful in this activity? You're providing, from the rubric to the resources to the instruction, everything they need put together to then deliver a strong activity, assessment, whatever it may be. Perfect. And then there's, the evaluation stage, which, as I mentioned, it's when students come and they'll see the work of their peers and they'll actually go through with that same rubric. So that rubric, I know sometimes you provide the rubric in the syllabus or at the start of the assignment, you might talk about it and then it becomes kind of thrown at the back and they don't really refer to it until the end. In this way, they have to grade their students or evaluate their peers based on this rubric. So it's important in that way. And as a professor, you can adjust how the students assess their peers. You can add comments, and of course, you can do the spotlight as I showed before. And you would set it up so you can choose, how many evaluators you want the students to have, 3, 4, 5 plus, depending on maybe the class size, the assignment type, all of that stuff. And then lastly, we have the feedback stage, which how do students provide feedback on the evaluations? So really, for strong feedback, if you think about it from a professor's perspective, what does it take to deliver to have a strong piece of feedback that's going to be both motivational and critical? Well, those are the two aspects that they're assessing here. And they can add a note as well to say, this is why, it was a 3 out of 4 critical. And it just helps students learn over time how to develop those skills, because there's actually something there telling them why they were strong or what they needed to work on. Perfect. So with that, I'm going to return quickly here, and we're going to go through a couple of activities. And this is where, Whitney, I'm going to bring you in, put you, ask you a couple of questions. We have this assignment here, which is tech tools for teaching and learning. I know there's a lot of language here, but you can get a sense of how you've laid out and the types of resources that you've provided. And we'll be sharing the PowerPoints and all that afterwards. If you're trying to read the fine print, you'll have a chance to review that. But Whitney, maybe you can just share at a high level what this assignment was, what it was like implementing in Kritik, setting it up, all that kind of stuff, and maybe just your thoughts too on how it went for the students.
So this assignment, like Justin said, I teach in teacher preparation. So in this assignment, my students were actually picking technology tools that could be integrated into the classroom and doing a review about them and posting them on a collaborative learning environment called Padlet. So everybody had to review 3 technology tools they chose, choose 3, and then do reviews, explain the applications, explain any prices, what their uses are in the classroom, etc. So you can see there is a lot of verbiage in here, and I know that is scary, and I tell my students, like, don't freak out in the beginning, because it is broken down into different sections, and that's how it should be taken. So I was talking to Justin about this before, but I actually follow Quality Matters when I design my courses. So when I was setting it up in Kritik, it was incredibly easy for me to copy and paste it directly out of my LMS. So me creating it in Kritik took maybe 15 minutes because it was already created in my LMS, and I make sure that it matches what's in my LMS to cut down on confusion. Because if you have different directions and different spots, they're definitely going to be lost on it. So they choose their tools, they post them on Padlet, and it's separated by content area. And then I share that out with my professional learning network on Twitter, and they do too, so that we can share these technology reviews with other professionals that are in the classroom. Basically, I'm teaching them how to search out for technology tools that are useful for themselves and how to share what they learn with other people. So it is a collaborative assignment, and it's actually connected to the next assignment we're going to look at too. They're both in the same unit, and I try as much as possible to have some overlap between assignments that are in the same unit, just because these are things that we're building upon. So it starts out with tech tools and moves on to lesson planning. But in my experience, the students absolutely loved evaluating it in Kritik. It was incredibly easy for them with the rubric set up as it is. And I already had a rubric, so pulling it into Kritik was very easy. And then there were some things I didn't think about because mine's project-based. I don't think so much about adding a section for grammar errors, which obviously should be in there. So there were actually several things in the Kritik templates that I was able to use that should have been assessed, but I wasn't assessing them just because I hadn't thought about it. So those templates that they have are incredibly useful for their rubrics. So yeah. What else?
So in terms of just to provide that clarity, so at the end of this, what would kind of the final product be of this assignment that the students would submit?
So what they do is Padlet basically looks like sticky notes, and I have it organized in columns. I have one Padlet, so think of it as a big board with columns on it, digital board. And so if they're reviewing an elementary science tool, they would put it under the science section. So if a science teacher wants to scroll through, they can look at all science tools. Mm-hmm. So they add them to the collaborative Padlet, and at the end, I publish it and share it out. So that it's something also that they can publish and have some sort of pride in. One of the things that's really frustrating for a lot of students is what they consider busy work because they don't understand the point of it, which is one reason I'm so upfront about my learning objectives. But tying it to something they can be proud of, that's not just an assignment that's going to go sit in the professor's inbox until it gets graded or in the LMS. So this is one of those assignments that they can actually share on Twitter with their families and stuff to show what they're doing in class. And I absolutely adore it.
Which is great, because that means it kind of takes it beyond school, takes it beyond the class. It makes it get them a little bit motivated to
Well,
do the
and
work and do a
it's
really good job, obviously.
teacher
Yeah.
Twitter is a huge thing. If y'all aren't on it, I highly suggest it. Now, I will say that sometimes it is like the teacher's social room where, it's not always the best things, but there is a huge presence of educators on Twitter in every content area. So I find that sharing this out doesn't just help my students, it helps the other educators in my PLN. So they don't have to go searching for new technology tools. My kids can do the job for them.
That's great to note. And obviously you touched on the rubric a little bit. So this was a rubric that you brought in from Kritik, but you had used previously. Is that correct?
So tool 1, 2, 3 and portfolio component were mine. I stole the writing mechanics and grammar and text and readability from y'all, and y'all's wording was perfect. So I just incorporated it into my rubric.
Oh, perfect. And in terms of peer assessment, I mean, if you just leave it open, students can take all sorts of directions. So, I mean, obviously you provided very detailed, specific instructions and rationale and learning objective in combination with the rubric. How do you think that structure comes together to ensure that, the students, when they do provide the evaluations as students, it actually means that it's going to be good, it's going to be specific, it's going to be really focused on, what you're trying to get out of the assignment? How do you
Yeah.
think that goes in tandem there?
Part of what I do for that is show examples beforehand. When I'm talking about completing the assignment, I will show them good quality examples and give them feedback on them and tell them this is what makes it really good. These are the things you need to make sure to include. And I just did my calibration activity, which we'll talk about, but I had multiple levels of assessments in there so that it was, so that they could see various levels and give feedback on it. But that's my main thing is just, I've explained to my students that a key component of their job in the future is being able to give effective feedback that their students can learn from, and that I'm giving them the first exposure to that. So I think because of that, they tend to tune in a little more because this is a skill that they have to refine in the future. So I think my students invest more in it because I also, I'm a big proponent of collaborative learning, and this is one of the best collaborative learning tools because you can see what your peers are doing. And this is off topic, but I have a student who's having extreme anxiety right now, and she's having problems coming to class. And she's actually doing better now that she's evaluated some stuff in Kritik, and she sees what her peers are doing and that they're making the same mistakes she's making. And so I think this not only reinforces the concepts we're trying to teach with the content, but it makes the classroom more human because there are peers out there who are invested in your success. That's my opinion, at least.
No, and that's a great point. I think there's a couple of things that really stand out, and that's you modeling to your students or going over what does a strong evaluation look like, and talking with professors that have found success with peer assessment. That seems to be a common theme because evaluating is certainly a skill that they can develop, but oftentimes they're not pro evaluators at the start. Like as a professor, it takes many even years sometimes to develop that skill. So understanding that, how would you teach a new skill? Certainly Kritik helps you apply and practice that skill, but also having the professor support as a coach or mentor going over and modeling what that looks like prior to, I think is a really great thing that obviously has helped you, but has also helped other professors that we work with as well, which is great. Do you do that at the start, or do you have check-ins, or how do you kind of keep that going?
I do it at the beginning when I introduce the assignment. I go over the directions and I immediately introduce good examples. So I have one example for every assignment that I personally make, and I have at least 2 student exemplars so they can see the bare minimum of what they need to do, and then 2 examples at least of what's awesome. So I introduce those examples as soon as I introduce the directions to make those concrete connections between this is what I'm telling you to do and this is what your artifact will look like in the end. Now let's figure out the learning that happens in the middle.
Perfect. So I'm just going to show a couple examples here. What does it look like when a student evaluates their peer? And here's one example. We kept it anonymous, but essentially they're going through, they're going to be looking at or using the rubric that Whitney's providing the evaluation, and then their peer would then provide whether, the feedback on feedback, how motivational, how critical it was, using some written language there to kind of back up or help support the parts on the left side with the stars, or in the charts there on the right side, which is great. What did you find in terms of the level of evaluation, or the types, or how students were providing feedback to one another?
Last quarter, the one thing that was missing, because I was kind of beta testing it, was I didn't hit home on how important it was to leave written feedback. And so this quarter, I've gone more into trying to teach them how to leave critical, but helpful feedback. So that's one thing that I did before we did the calibration exercises. Even though you don't leave written feedback in there, I explained that they would be leaving written feedback. So that was the one issue I ran into. Otherwise, for the most part, they just jumped right in. And I found that, most students do actually score close to me or even harder than me on their peers. And, I don't know, and we're working off the same rubric. So they might just have a better understanding of their capabilities than I do, and they know what their peers are able to, to accomplish. What I love about this example that you chose is, if you look at the bottom on the left, the evaluator tells them that you didn't have your stuff in your portfolio, and then they also tell them you didn't do the links. And in the feedback comments, they say that they're going to go back and fix those things. So even though the grading had already been complete, the student understands that this is part of their portfolio and they need to go back and do it right. So, and, with my feedback, whether they choose to go back and do it or not, and even with this, is up to them. But the fact that it's coming from their peers and it is motivational while still being critical, I think that's a great mix. So I like this example.
Oh, thank you. It's from your class, but
yeah,
one of the things that is great, I think, about peer assessment just in general is that, yes, like you're always a bit vulnerable, so to speak, when you're putting yourself and accepting feedback and providing feedback, but very much it's not this competitive thing where you're trying to get at your peers, because it's a team effort. I mean, if I provide you with a strong evaluation and you provide me with a strong evaluation, what's going to happen? Well, we're both going to then improve our work and our understanding over time. So I think even making that clear to say, this is why we're doing it, and by providing and taking the time and care to do it well, this is how you'll all benefit from it later on. Do you think your students got that right away, in terms of if they provide strong evaluations and in return receive, then that will just kind of be mutually or beneficial to the group?
I think the vast majority of them did. You're always going to have a few outliers who don't want to engage in the process, no matter what the process is. But the vast majority of my students, they told me at my end of course evaluation that Kritik was one of the most enjoyable parts of the course, and that they learned so much from the process of giving feedback and, giving feedback on their feedback. And like, I have my students create a comprehensive portfolio, so they still do have a chance, even though the grading's done, to improve their work for the final piece. So it falls right in line with that. And my students all, I didn't have a single negative feedback come through. And as we know, with college students, usually you're going to have something negative. So I consider that a total win.
Absolutely. It's hard to please everyone. So I'll take that as a pretty good sign. Great. So here's another activity. This one, I think.
Lesson planning.
Pardon me?
I think this is lesson planning. Yeah.
It is lesson planning. I just noticed the title is cut off on my presentation screen here, but it is lesson planning. And there's a great amount of resources and videos here. So similar format, but obviously different because it's a different assignment. What were you looking for in this activity? And how did you set it up here? What was your thought process in providing these resources and rationale and such?
Sorry if y'all can hear my dogs barking. I'm just going to throw that out there. I did lock them out of the room, but so I set it up just like I did the other assignment, and in Moodle, this is how I have it set up. This lesson planning is one of the hardest, I will say it's the hardest assignment in my class. Because I'm the first one to introduce them to a lesson plan. They've never seen one before. So that is why you see a ton of resources, and the videos are actually me lecturing and breaking it all down into chunks so that they can go back over it to get any concepts they miss. So I follow the exact same setup as I did on the other one, the learning objectives, the rationale, and it all goes with quality matters. Um, but this assignment specifically, they tend to get the absolute best feedback on. And so I told you these two assignments go hand in hand. Well, in the first assignment, they have to choose 3 technology tools to review. Well, in this assignment, they're given a well-written lesson plan and they have to insert technology in meaningful ways. So they could actually use the technology tools they already reviewed as part of their lesson plan exercise. So I save them a little bit of time that way. But the whole point is to look at a lesson plan and figure out how to stick technology in there in a meaningful way. And this is the number one assignment that they tend to bomb. I know that last quarter I had higher numbers passing it simply because, they I think they were talking more about it to each other because they know that they'd see each other's work. Um, so I think that might be part of it, but they got incredibly good feedback from their peers and some things I wouldn't even think about just because these students are fresh out of the K-12 classroom. Their teachers have been using technology tools that I might not know about. So they have a lot of great ideas to add to, and using Critic allowed them to easily share those ideas, but also see what other students were doing with lesson planning and how they were integrating technology into their lesson plan. So every student, when they evaluate, they actually have to go in and look at the original lesson plan and decide if the student, the creator, was considering the teaching strategies outlined and the learning outcomes when they chose the technology they would integrate. So using it in Critic has just way reinforced all of these concepts I've been trying to teach them and that they've been missing for so long. And I actually chose to do my calibration activity off of a lesson plan. And so I wrote 3 examples like they would see in this assignment, and they did the calibration. So I was able to reinforce the content and the exercise through the calibration activity too. So now, before they've even started to go in and work on their lesson plan, they've already seen a not good example, a pretty good example, and a great example. So they already know how to score that and what we're looking for in the rubric. So I think that calibration helped to reinforce the concepts in this lesson. But like I said, this is one that they tend to bomb, if I'm being totally honest, just because they miss the concepts and don't reach out for help. So Critic has been great in at least giving them multiple points of feedback that aren't just me.
That's perfect. And I think that goes, I mean, there's not one really, I find there's not one element that would lead to success. It's kind of a combination of things, and things that you've highlighted even in this conversation, you starting off that semester highlighting or going through what does successful, what do strong evaluations look like, providing really specific rationale and learning objectives and instructions, even resources for them to go in and educate or learn more about the material if they have questions, which I think is great. Calibrating, showing them what kind of a not so strong, middle to really strong assignment looks like. So all these pieces put together, it helps, I think, put them on the path that they can be more successful. But it's in combination, I would say, with all those different pieces that you've done to kind of help set your students up for success. And
well, and I will say this is all related to teacher ed, but it is applicable to any content area. I don't see how it would not, peer assessment would not be useful in almost every content area. So it's especially useful for us in education. But
well, yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the biggest thing here is that, you're teaching pre-service teachers that literally will have to take their evaluation skills and do it from almost from your perspective as a teacher later on in their career. But who else, what other types of professionals are required to provide feedback and take those similar skills? Like virtually every career, every professional route you can take.
Anybody in any kind of management position, because you're going to be giving feedback on the people who work for you.
Absolutely. So, and I think making that clear to your students is incredibly important because they love to know the why. I mean, students have so many courses, they have so many things that are on their plate. They want to know that what they're doing now is actually going to benefit them later. And of course, they hope that, but making it really explicit is always super important. So I think making it clear that you do this, and this is how it will help lead to your success in the future, regardless of what course you're teaching, is a really big part here. And I would say that ties into building a really positive classroom environment, is being on that level with your students and saying, I know you're doing this. You might not love it all the time. You might be frustrated. You might whatever. You might have these feelings, but this is why you're doing it. And better for you to realize this now than, in 3 years after you graduated and you don't have this support network. So I think that's super important. One topic that I know we've alluded to a little bit, but it's you're teaching this course, but also you work with faculty to help them implement technology and make the most out of it in their courses, which I find is a super interesting point. And one thing that you've noted is trying to find tech to meet your needs. So when you're looking at different, ed tech out there, what do you look for in that type of technology to think, yes, this is strong tech, this is going to help me or fellow professors be more effective in their teaching? What are those types of things that you look for?
Well, I first look at their learning outcomes, what you want the students to actually learn throughout the context of the unit or the lesson. And then I look at the teaching strategies. How do you plan on teaching this actual lesson? And I know in K-12 teaching strategies are a much huger thing, but we all have some sort of teaching strategies we go by. So I consider what my students are going to learn and how I want to teach them. And then I find the tool that fits that. Mm-hmm. So it might, so Padlet, the example I used earlier for tech tools in the classroom, that is a collaborative environment. I use a lot of Google tools, but it really depends on what you were trying to do with the technology. And so I tell my students, you can integrate technology in multiple ways. It can be what you're doing as a teacher. It can be what your students are doing with technology, but it can also be how you're using it for assessment. So those are all things to take into consideration when you're trying to choose your correct technology tool. And I actually have I'll minimize this real quick and jump on my LMS while I'm talking about it, but I actually have several links to some great websites to search for technology tools. So I'll throw those in here too. And you can search based on what you're trying to do with it.
Perfect. And obviously, when you encountered Kritik, you probably went through these similar thought processes. What kind of tech is this? How it will help me?
Oh, yeah.
What was that like? And what kind of, I don't want to say sold you on it, but what led you from discovery to actually using the platform, and from your perspective as someone that helps others implement tech and make the most of it? What was your thought process there?
So I'll be perfectly honest, the first thing I thought was it cost money. And usually, because I'm in public education, I don't go for things that cost money, but you got to do a cost benefit analysis. And I've done peer assessment in the past, and I've used Google Forms. And while it's possible, it's a hot mess and a nightmare. And to aggregate it, like I said, it's possible, but I don't even remember how I originally heard about Kritik, but the thought of a peer assessment system with algorithms built into it that we can actually have data pulled from to see that, and for us to prove that we're having a feedback loop is incredibly valuable. And so when I decided that I was thinking about implementing Kritik into my classroom, what I did was I made a panel. I asked for volunteers from my old students who have passed my class before. And I asked for a volunteer panel to go through basically the sales pitch and see what they thought of the system. And then we had a discussion after we talked to Kritik. And the funniest feedback I got was from one of my students who was not tech savvy to begin with, who said, I'm in the South, first of all, y'all, I'm in Louisiana. So he said, I didn't pay $100 for that thing if I could have. Students see value in it, and every single student that I had on that panel thought that it would really contribute to my teaching and their learning in the classroom. So that's why I decided to go ahead and integrate it. And last quarter was my first quarter where I did almost every single assignment on Kritik, and it was a learning experience. I realized after the first assignment that I hadn't even built into the scoring what would happen if they didn't submit to Kritik. Hello. So fool me once, I'll fix it on the second one. So for me, I did go through a little bit of a beta process where I told my students, I don't know what I'm doing with this. I understand the basics. And it's with like any technology tool. You have to be honest. This is something I'm learning with you. We're in this learning experience together. And so my students really appreciated the candor and they enjoyed the experience. So I've been preaching to everybody at my university about how they need to pick it up. Um, so.
No, that's a great point in terms of joining the students on that learning experience. I think sometimes there might be pressure as a professor or as that person at the teaching the course to say, no, I know everything. This is like this is the platform that I'm implementing. There's no questions. But we know that's often not the case. Even if you've been using a platform for multiple years, tech seems to change over time, and there's new things to continue to
Oh,
learn.
yeah.
So being open and saying to your students, this is why we're using it, but we're both going to be on this. And I think encouraging students to be open in terms of their questions, if they have roadblocks, or if you have roadblocks, to just be really open and transparent, because that teaches them not just about the platform, but that's just a good life practice in general, to just be open and address things head on. Did you find, in terms of student feedback, I think you shared that there was a poll that you ran. What types of comments or feedback did students provide on their experience?
The thing that they enjoyed the most was getting the written feedback from peers. So for the people who didn't receive the written feedback, they felt, I wouldn't necessarily say cheated, but they felt like they didn't get as much out of the experience. So that was a big piece of the feedback. They also enjoyed, now I ended up doing a finalized score last quarter because they were learning the system and I was learning it too. This quarter, the finalized score is going to come out of Kritik. So this quarter, they're all excited about the fact that they're going to see their scores much quicker, because I do have so many students and it takes me, 15 to 45 minutes to grade one lesson plan assignment. So I'm hesitant to say it in this way, but because you mentioned it in the beginning, the decrease in grading burden has just been life-changing for me personally. It is just, I have so much more free time now to actually concentrate on helping my students and remediating them when they need it, instead of going through and assessing everything. So there's much more teaching time. And because I can see as soon as they finish up all the evaluation stages, the scores, that means, let's see, what is it for me? 6 days after they turn in their original submission, they've already got all their feedback. So, that's a pretty fast turnaround time for something that's so labor intensive to grade. Last quarter, they still had to wait on me, but this quarter, they're excited about the fact that they'll be able to see their scores sooner.
Yeah, and I think, that piece that you just mentioned about decreasing the grade turnaround time, I know sometimes because through this experience, people are hesitant to mention that as a benefit. But then right after you mentioned it, you also mentioned a second point, which was you have now more time to spend with the students and coach them, mentor you, and you're not just sitting there with a pile or a stack of assignments that you have to grade. You have more resources and more time to actually do things with the students that might have a higher impact on their learning. So I don't think reducing grading burden in itself isn't a bad thing. In any other world, when we're reducing or streamlining or being more efficient with our processes, that's a positive thing. And I think the same holds true within the world of academia. If you can get back more time and spend it with your students, remediating or if you're noticing through your calibration that some are struggling and spending that individual attention, I mean, that's a very positive thing, I think, for their learning. And we just ran a poll with some various benefits, and certainly that was one that some people relate to as well. And I would say, in terms of coaching and mentoring students, that's a big piece of that as well. Were there any other benefits that kind of drew you to Kritik? Speaking of the benefits of peer assessment, so you have maybe reducing the grading time. You shared that you approach peer assessment maybe differently in the past, and this has helped. Was that something you were looking for, a more improved process, or what else went through your mind when you were looking for a platform for peer assessment?
So I've done peer assessment in the past, but pre-COVID, and then during COVID, everything went out the window. So when I was wanting to reintroduce it once we were going back on campus, I had already heard about Critic. So for me, it wasn't that I was necessarily looking for a peer evaluation system. Critic kind of found me and I just fell in love with it. So for me, besides saving me a huge amount of time and giving me that time back to help my students learn, it's literally increased my personal well-being.
Mhm.
And I mean, I don't say this lightly, but even my therapist knows what Critic is, okay? Because it's been that helpful in my own life because I'm in a doctoral program right now. I have 2 children, and as much time as I would love to devote to giving my students the best feedback, I know that that's just not the reality of the situation. And that by allowing them to give peer feedback, I'm giving them extensions on learning too.
That's, yeah, super powerful. Alicia provided a great question here. So how do you handle situations where a student isn't as effective at assessing their peers and it creates an unfair situation for both the assessor and the student being assessed? I have a thought here, but did you have any?
Well, part of that is the grading power algorithm. So that helps even it out some, but also with the calibration activity, you can see easily through that activity who did not do well. So I went through and looked at my data from that this morning, my scores, and anybody under who missed it, who didn't get close enough to my scores, I'm going to sit them down and I'm going to show them all 3 examples and explain why I got my scores. And now I have the free time to actually do that,
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, that's a great point. I would say, Alicia, as well, so it's anonymous, first of all, so students, in terms of grading their friends higher or whatnot, that doesn't really play in. Students are assessed by multiple students, like at least at a minimum 3. So one student actually won't have that skewing ability, and as Whitney mentioned, so there's a grading power. So, and the calibration helps with this, but students are actually given a grading power to determine how strong of an evaluator are they, and that grading power adjusts after each activity. So if a student isn't as strong as an evaluator or as effective at assessing their peers, as you mentioned, then they would have a lower grading power, and that means that their assessments count lower, have a lower weighting to students that have a higher grading power. So that is a big thing, a big factor or feature that helps ensure accuracy of student grades. There's a dispute feature, which means if a student receives an assessment and they just don't feel like it was accurate, or they have some issue with it, they click that dispute button and they have to share why. They can't just press dispute, but that's another way for them to voice their opinion. We find that less than 4% of students actually dispute, but that's there if they still choose to.
Well, and I had, I think out of the whole quarter, maybe 3 grade disputes. And all 3 of them were warranted. So, and it flags it real easily so that you can see as soon as you get on that there's a dispute, you can see it right in the activity when you look at it. And for the most part, my students, none of them actually complained personally to me that they didn't think that the scores they received were accurate. But I understand how that can be a concern, which is one of the reasons I wanted to get off of using Google Forms, because everybody has the exact same grading power. They all have the same impact on their peers. And that's not the case how it should be.
For sure. Yeah. And yeah, we find very little, as you mentioned, like a low percentage of students actually dispute their grades. But I would note, if this is a concern, that a dispute isn't an inherently negative thing in this process. If a student is challenging, then that's an amazing teachable moment, especially if you're teaching pre-service teachers. Like this is, if there's any kind of challenge, that's a great opportunity for learning. So you mentioned, one approach dealing with this, which would be identifying if there was some kind of challenge, to communicate to the student what was going on, how they might improve, or how they might improve their process. And that is a very powerful moment for the student and for the professor in the class. But you won't have that if you don't create the mechanisms for them to evaluate their peers, to dispute something. You're creating this environment where they're pushing, and if you have questions, they raise that. And as a professor, you can also have that high level view to see how your students are evaluating, how they're communicating with their peers, which is great too, because you have this inner scope of those types of conversations. Was that something you were actively monitoring, Whitney, those types of conversations and how your students were interacting?
So we've only done calibration this quarter. Last quarter, I was so excited about it that I was looking at all the feedback. And it just astounded me the time and effort these students will put in if you give them the opportunity to do it. So I was very pleased with that they took it seriously. And for the most part, everybody seemed to give their all into the process and want to learn how to give good feedback and how to receive feedback and how to improve on it.
That's perfect. And I'm cognizant of time. We've reached the minute, but it's always good when I don't suspect it and I look at the clock and we're at time. It usually means it's a good conversation. So thank you, Whitney, for your time. Of course, in the chat, if you're curious, if you want to learn more, I know Whitney shares her one experience, but we know everyone would approach it or peer assessment or has different goals and objectives. So we encourage you to meet with our team. I think Emily will drop a link in the chat there. But also if you have, add on Twitter, absolutely. And we will be sharing a quick survey. It'll take you 30 seconds, but we love feedback. And if you have feedback on the workshop, we'll continue to improve. Yeah, and we'll just end with a huge note of thanks to you, Whitney, for your time and for sharing your input and your activities and everything else. So big thanks.
If y'all have any questions, please feel free to contact me. I love to help out.